The one that says record on this computer. Got it. We're recording. Thank you, Steve. Again, welcome to the Smitty Story Hour. We'll give everybody another minute or so to log in. We'll get started with the Smitty Story Hour featuring Dr. Curt Stager. This series has been brought to us by the Paul Smith College Alumni Association. We are recording, so if you missed some part of it or have to log out early, do check back on our website. This recording will be available, as are other recordings of previous Smitty Story Hours we've had. During this session, if you have any questions of our guest speaker, please put them in the question and answer or the Q&A section, or you can throw them into the chat. And towards the end of the session, Dr. Stager will be asking for those questions, so I will read them. So any questions that come up throughout the presentation, please put them in, and we'll get to them towards the end or whenever Curt's ready. What else can I tell you? Also, if you would take a moment and just log into the chat with your name, class year, if you're an alum, and location. You know, say you're in sunny Florida, please rub it in. We want to know because it's 20-something degrees here and snowing last I checked. We're doing pretty good, Curt.
Well, there's Peggy. Hi, Peggy.
Excellent, yeah. Amy Harridan, I bet you Jay's listening too. Daniel Dwyer in Brooklyn, not too sunny and warm. Yeah, I feel your pain, Daniel. Apex, North Carolina.
Yay.
All right. Randy Collins, don't know where you are, but hi, Randy. Allison Appleby.
There's Al. Hello, Al. Well, hello, everybody.
There he is. Oh, Dr. Strauss is here. Sit up straight.
Uh-oh.
Oh, Nicole Morin and Ryan Baker zooming in from Saranac Lake. Karen Frank. Hi, Karen. I bet Pete's in the background. And Rocket, their dog. Oh, who we got in Fairbanks? Leslie and George LeBar in Fairbanks, Alaska. All right. Oh, Mrs. Strauss is with us as well. All right. And we have Peggy Lynn and Dan Dugan, of course. And Jack the dog. Hi, Jack the dog. And let's see. Jim is here from Longview, Washington. All right. Mary Beth Bird says it's 70 degrees. Sorry. Hi, Marcy the dog. Mark Caulfield, surveying, class of 82 in Connecticut, my home state. Peter and Jane Whitchurch, Bridgeton, Maine. All right. These are some great places. We've got Ohio and Paul Cantwell in Malone. All right. Fletcher in New York City. And Bear the dog, Podunk, Massachusetts. All right. In all fairness, Molly's here too. Molly, who I like to call my Alaskan yellow lab. Pennsylvania, Buffalo. All right. Curt, you're doing great here.
A lot of familiar names on this list. This is great.
It absolutely is. Another one in Florida. Hi, Sandy. Bill Studiford in Troy. All right. Kaylee in Boston. This is great. All right, Curt, we're looking at 7:05.
All right.
So whenever you're ready, Good evening,
Sure.
everyone. Welcome to the Smitty Story Hour featuring Dr. Curt Stager. We're going to talk about climate change in the Adirondacks tonight. Again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And towards the end of the session, Dr. Stager will answer these questions. With that, Curt, take it away.
All right. Let me mess with the buttons here. I'll try to get the first picture up.
I have faith in you. You can do
Yeah,
this.
well, that may be a mistake. See,
Not at all.
here we go now.
I knew it.
All of these controls are in the way of, there it is. Come on. There. And I'm going to try to minimize a few other things so I can see things.
Excellent. I'm
All right.
seeing the first slide, Curt. This is perfect.
That's good. And yeah, let me also see if it changes. No, it's not changing yet. Let me see. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So welcome. Thanks for coming out on the web. Tonight we'll talk about climate change, not global so much, but things we can see going on around here in the Adirondacks, including things on the campus of Paul Smith College. Some of this is research I've done informally or semi-formally over the years, but also Paul Smith students have been involved in this as well. So for some of you, you probably participated in some of these results that you'll be seeing coming up. So let's just dig right into it. Feel free to do the question and answer, or raise a hand, or even unmute and interrupt if something's not making sense. So we have weather stations in the uplands of the Adirondacks. I've put red stars here. We've got about half a dozen of them. They're with the United States Historical Climatology Network. So they're official stations, carefully run and documented. Their information is put up on the web, so you can get the latest temperature, precipitation, things like that. So what I'm going to show you tonight is kind of the more recent update from a student project. This is compilation of and number crunching by Skylar Murphy, who just graduated. She's thinking of going to grad school at Cornell now. But anyway, so I'll be sort of quoting some of her results for you, just to show you it, in case you wondered, is global warming here as well as up in the Arctic, where the polar bears are and things like that? And it absolutely is. The things we're seeing going on here are pretty similar, especially since about 1970 or something like that, where it really picked up. So that fits the global picture as well. That's about the time period when we're pretty sure the human impacts on the global climates have pretty much outweighed all the other factors, like the sun getting stronger or weaker, or volcanoes affecting the climate. This is the effect of fossil fuel burning. So we still have the ups and downs from year to year with temperature. We'll have a severe winter and then a mild winter and things like that. And the Adirondacks have always done that. But if you take the long-term view of the climate trend, it's a clear warming trend, just like the global picture. So these are data of the last little over a century from Lake Placid, and the other Adirondack stations show the same thing. So I asked Skylar to number crunch month by month when the greatest warming is. And I'm going to mess with another button or two here, try to get these things to go away because they're blocking things I need to see. So this is meant to be a chart of the year by month. So January would be month number 1 on the lower axis there. And then reading over to the right at number 12 would be December. And she got the average warming since 1970 in degrees Fahrenheit and made a bar chart to show which times of year most of the warming is happening. And it turns out some times of year are warming a lot and some are not very much at all. So the months with the greatest warming in the last half century are in the winter. It's December and January. So we've got it on here. We've got the 4 degrees warmer on average since 1970 for December, and then January. And then oddly enough, February hasn't changed that much. So let's look at this. Winter, I think, is where some of the biggest changes are happening. So the basic story we're getting is maybe you could say traditionally the Adirondack year was like half summer and half winter, pretty much. But as the world is warming, the basic pattern we're seeing is the summers are starting to dominate the year more than the winters, and winter is gradually going away. And it's pretty likely that over the super long term, on the order of centuries, we're basically going to lose winter as we know it. Not exactly in our lifetimes, but we'll start seeing that trend pretty clearly as we go along. So here's some illustrations of kind of the big picture here of what snow cover might look like, let's say in upstate New York. This is from Jerry Jenkins's book on climate change here, and just estimating if you have darker blue mean more snow in the winter and things like that. Over time, if you read these maps of New York from left to right, you get less and less snow cover over time during this century. And of course, the wild card in all of this is what we do, how much more carbon dioxide we release by burning the fossil fuels. So the more we burn, the more it'll warm, and the faster the winter will go away. So some years ago, Mary, Phil, and I with the Nature Conservancy just did a regional study of climate change in the Champlain Basin, so including the Adirondack side and the Vermont side and then the lake itself. And we had access to 16 climate models that were focused in just on the Champlain Basin. It's called downscaling. And we took the basic picture from each model and combined them all and got the basic picture, which sort of makes common sense. It should get warmer the rest of this century, and maybe twice as warm or more if we continue burning fossil fuels at the rate we're doing it now, without cutting back and finding alternative energy and things like that. So basic common sense, the more we emit, the warmer it's going to get. Estimates from the models say, in the extreme case, by the end of the century, it could be 6 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit warmer on average. So one way to look at it, sometimes people talk about, is the Adirondacks over time, within the next couple centuries at least, could end up being a lot like the Blue Ridge. You could say our northern climates will maybe, you could say that the South would be moving up into our northern climates like that. And that raises some interesting questions. Maybe you'll have some thoughts on this too as you're listening, but what is the difference really if we became more like the Blue Ridge? Okay, both places have the mountains. They're both beautiful. People love them both. The biggest difference that I can think of as far as living here is that we've got winter, like really severe Adirondack North Country winter. That to me is the biggest difference. And that affects who lives here, what the cultures are like, what the economy is like, and things like that. So if winter is gradually going away, that's a major cultural shift in the Adirondacks. So I've asked people formally and informally over the years, you know, what do you think of this? So I was talking to Chuck Bruja some years ago down there at the Mountaineer. He runs the outing goods store down there in the Ausable Valley. And I said, oh, what do you think, people like you, when you're selling all this winter gear here, what does it mean if we're losing winter? And he said, where we live defines who we are, and winter defines the North Country. So it's really interesting what this could mean as winter kind of goes away. And you think about it, when you think of the Adirondacks, you know, who are we? People come here and things like that. So, well, we got Lake Placid, and that's why I came up in 1980. They had the Olympics, the second Olympic Games, and I ended up meeting Peggy Lynn, who's here, and we played guitar and stuff in the bars and met at the athletes, and then the rest is history. That's how I got connected to Paul Smith College. So we have the winter sports industry and the traditions, and it's part of our marketing. We've got the Winter Carnival, although we didn't have much of one this year. Things like that. So to think of winter changing like that really does hit home. There's also the historical tradition of working on the land in a place that has winter. So like the logging industry going back, let's say, to the 1800s, we'd think, you know, it was kind of tough being out there in sub-zero temperatures chopping the trees. But the flip side of that was when you could count on it being bitter cold, the ground was frozen. So it was hard. And in a time when there wasn't a lot of pavement around, icy frozen ground was actually the easiest time in a lot of cases to get the trees out of the forest. Here's what it's like when you don't have hard ground. So people are starting to notice this, folks who work in the woods around here. In the mild winters we have, you have less time to do your harvesting in the woods before you run into something like this quagmire right here. So we also have evidence right before people's eyes that the winter is changing. Not even necessarily with science in mind, just informal things. Those of you that are alums might remember the ice out contests we've had at the college over the years, dating back to about 1970. I think it was Ted Mack and Neil Serpernant used to run it out of the library, and they would accept bets on when people thought the ice was going to go out on Lower St. Regis Lake. And they kept the numbers, like a lot of ice out contests people do, because people are gambling and they want the records carefully kept so you know who really won or not and got the money, and also what it was like in the past to help you predict the future. So I've taken on being the latest archivist of this. And when you add it all up, we certainly have later freeze ups. It's between 1 and 2 weeks later freeze up than when it was around 1970, and also earlier ice outs, again, maybe 10 days or something like that. So winter is shrinking on both ends, and you can see it happening right here on our own lake. You can see it on a larger scale too, down in Lake Champlain. Basically any of the lakes around here have this. One of the interesting things about Lake Champlain though is it's got one of the longest records around. This one goes back 2 centuries. And I've drawn a timeline on the bottom of this, starting in the early 1820s and then reading over to the right up to about the present day. And I've put a little asterisk along that timeline for every winter when the main basin of Lake Champlain did not freeze totally in the winter. And if you read from left to right, there were just a couple of times in the 1800s when that basin stayed open. And then as you keep going towards the present day, it becomes more and more common not to freeze up. And now it's actually unusual for the part between Plattsburgh and Burlington to freeze solid in the winter. So that's a pretty clear sign of a major climate change going on. And that obviously affects people directly. I remember when I first showed up in 1980, and during the 1980s, there would always be these stories in the spring of the ice fisher shanty towns that would form on the ice here. And then people would not want to stop as the winter ended. And so shanties and people would always get stuck out on the ice as it was breaking up, and they'd have to be rescued and things like that. So some of you may remember those stories. That kind of story is more and more rare because the ice is becoming more and more rare too. So just asking around, people in this area see these changes, and what I find just as interesting as the global picture is having people tell you what the effects of these changes are on them or their lifestyle or people or ecosystems they know. So with the Lake Champlain story, for example, I thought, well, if the ice is going away, maybe that's a good thing for the ferry service because there's less ice. They don't have to break so much ice to go through in winter and stuff. Maybe they save on fuel and things. So I spoke to some of the ferry operators. Here's Russell Fox from the Burlington area. He said, no, actually, most of the ferry people prefer the frozen winters. And that's because if you don't have the ice, if you get a winter storm, the wind makes it a really rough ride, and the spray is blowing all over the cars and freezing up. And there was a neat physics thing he mentioned. He said that in the winter, the super cold water is actually denser than it is in the summer. So when a big winter storm wave hits the side of the boat, it really slams in there extra hard and it makes the ride extra rough. So that's something I never would have thought of. You get it right from the people who live here seeing these changes happen. So when we talk about climate change, you know, I assume all of you signed on to this thinking, oh, a climate change talk, I'm going to go home depressed. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's all bad, right? So like, for example, there are agricultural effects. The growing seasons are changing here. And one of the possible benefits could be, you know, if you like wine and grapes, the climate has been getting better for those. There's even a wine trail, an international wine trail in the Champlain Valley. So it's just that it's true that it's changing. We are the ones living here who know what that means and know it best for us, whether it's good or bad, or certainly going to be a mix. So there are going to be winners and losers. So you could say, okay, if you're going into the wine industry and the grape industry, you may be a long-term winner. Speaking to people who do a lot of hunting around here, say, well, as the winters are milder, the deer survive the winter better. So there could be more deer for hunting. That could maybe consider yourself a winner then. The flip side of that is critters like deer carry ticks, and those ticks, the deer ticks, carry Lyme disease and babesiosis and all these other kinds of illnesses too. And those illnesses are moving into the North Country, like my colleague, Dr. Leanne Sporn, talked about recently in one of these series here. So this is actually some of the work by Leanne and her students, where they mapped out the terrain, looking at the climate, and just basically what is the best habitat for deer ticks right now. And the map on the left with the big blue area, that's the uplands of the Adirondacks. The greener the color is, the better the habitat is for ticks. So using the climate model projections, they came up with this estimate that pretty much the whole Adirondack region will be very tick friendly by the end of the century. So again, to summarize it, we're getting shorter, milder winters on average, although, you know, year to year it can vary. The flip side of that, of course, then, is you get longer and hotter summers, and we'll take a look at that in a minute too. So here's what the same old bar chart looks like with Schuyler's analysis of these weather stations. Moderate warming in the 3 months of summer, would say June, July, August, between 1 and 2 degrees warming since 1970. So what does that mean? Well, one of the things would be the temperature affects lakes, and it affects the layering, the temperature layering within a lake, and that affects the fish, who lives where and who does well under those conditions. And so even if you're not like a lake scientist, you've probably experienced this if you've ever swum in a lake in the summer. You're swimming along, nice warm water, and then you dive down a little deep, or you kick down with your feet and the water's cold underneath you. So you want to stay in the warm top layer. So our lakes develop a top and a bottom, warm and cool down below kind of a thing. That kind of a structure affects which kind of fish can live where in the lake. So you might say warm water fish like bass and pike and yellow perch prefer that warmer upper layer, and things like lake trout prefer, cold water fish will prefer the deeper, partly for the temperature, partly because it holds more oxygen down there too when it's nice and cool. But there's a potential problem, and that's if it gets longer, hotter summers, this layering or stratification can be more intense and last longer. And if it goes on for too long, the deep water where it's cool can run out of oxygen, dissolved oxygen that keeps the fish alive. And we're seeing signs that we are starting to lose some of the trout communities in some of the lakes around here, both brook trout and lake trout. And one possibility is because of the warming. Either the temperature is too much or it's staying stratified too long. And this is having direct impacts on how some people are thinking long-term about resource management around here. And this is a case here with the Nature Conservancy, who relatively recently bought Follinsby Pond near Tupper Lake, a beautiful area. It's very deep, it's more than 100 feet deep. So it's got this deep reservoir of cold, oxygen-rich water, and it's got a relatively unimpacted large population of lake trout, like monster lake trout, like in the old days. So rather than treat this as a recreational destination where you go and catch all the fish and then they're gone, the Nature Conservancy is trying to think of this then as a climate refuge for lake trout. Because this lake is so deep, it will resist the effects of the warming in summer that could wipe them out in other lakes that don't have the deep water reservoir in them like that. So some people are taking the climate change seriously enough to plan how they manage the resource in the face of a changing world. So keeping in mind, of course, there's more to climate change than just temperature. So of course the precipitation too. It's also been getting wetter here since the 1970s as well, combining the 6 Adirondack stations. Not only getting wetter, but just like we're seeing globally on average, the intensity of the rainstorms is increasing. So we've looked at Dannemora, Cornwall, Vermont, some other places like that, basically plotting out for the last century how big the biggest rainstorms were and how common they were. And if you read this chart here from left to right, the blue dots are the higher they are on the chart, the more rainfall fell in a single storm. And if you read from left to right, the amount is increasing. So our wet events are stronger and wetter, just like you expect in the global picture. And here's a picture from Keene, people's backyards when we had the tropical storm that dumped tons and tons of rain and washed people out. This was Irene. It started as a hurricane, slowed down the winds, so it went off the media because it wasn't blowing roofs off houses, but it dumped so much water that it just about destroyed this part of Keene here. So this used to be people's backyards and homes all wiped away by this little brook that flooded. So you can also see signs of this, though less dramatic, but signs of the greater wetting since 1970. Those of you that are alums might remember Bear Pond. That was a great destination when I got here first in the 1980s. We'd go there because the water was so clear. It was like a swimming pool. And the water was the color of the blue sky in the photo on the left there. It doesn't look like that anymore. But those of you that have been there in the past might remember there was a swimming rock over to the right as you came in from the carry, and we'd sit out there and sunbathe and dive off. And then there was a little island off to the left with a tree growing on it, and you weren't allowed to camp there. I got arrested doing it once. This is what that island looks like now. There's a DEC no camping sign on the drowned tree. The lake level has come up. And this is common for a lot of the lakes around here because it's gotten wetter. And if you look along the shore, you see these tree roots going down into the water. And of course, trees don't sprout underwater. If you see that, that means the lake level has come up since the trees took root. So these are signs anybody can see that it's getting warmer and wetter in recent decades here in the Adirondacks. There's another thing that happens with this too. Okay, on the left is a scan of a slide I took back in the 1980s at Bear Pond. You can see how clear and beautiful blue it used to be. Here's what it looks like today. Kind of greenish, brownish. Not ugly by any means. It's still a beautiful place to go, but you know, it's not spectacular like that other thing. Okay, well, part of the reason it was so clear compared to now was acid rain. So it was basically acid sterilized, which is why we thought it was so beautiful. So we should say that with the amendments to the Clean Air Act and cutting back on acid rain successfully, we have this great positive outcome story of careful federal and state regulations that have cleaned up the air, made acid rain much less of a problem without bankrupting the energy industry. So that's a good lesson to learn. The flip side, though, is, of course, if you really liked Bear Pond the way it was, that's not here anymore. And not only that, though, it's not just that Bear Pond has recovered from its acidic state. This is a unique state. that it's never had. We take sediment cores from the lakes around here and look back centuries through time and have done it on Bear Pond. For thousands of years, there has not been a condition like this. This is new, and part of it is because of climate change. Not only did it become less acidic, but because it's wetter and warmer, the forest floor with all of the leaf litter and pine needles and twigs and things is sort of like a tea bag with all the leaf litter in the tea bag. And if you put warm water on it, it soaks out the tannins and the organic matter, and then it washes into the lakes and feeds them too. It's nutritious for algae. It changes the chemistry, changes the color. So this is happening all over the temperate zone, and well, in North America at least. It's called browning. And so to flip back to Bear Pond, what's happening here is a combination of browning and more algae are floating in the plankton now, and they give it a greenish brownish color. So again, this ties into climate change, making what we call novel ecosystems or non-analog ecosystems, which have never been here before. You can't go all the way back when you try to restore an ecosystem to what it was, because the world itself is changing around the ecosystem. So to start wrapping up, what do we do about all this? Well, it's a global thing going on here affecting us. But at least to get started, I always think the motto that I think really fits what we do at Paul Smith College well comes from a scientist in the 1800s, Thomas Henry Huxley. And he said, we need to learn what is true in order to do what is right. And I feel like that's really kind of the spirit of Paul Smith College, isn't it? Where we do our best to really stick to the science or the facts and really get a grip on what's really going on. And then you can discuss what to do about it or the rights and wrongs of it and things like that. So one of the things we do a lot at the college, always used to, and now we're still doing it, but also keeping the records and making long-term monitoring. We're observing, recording, and sharing what's going on with the animals and plants around here as the world changes. So this actually has a long tradition in the region. People have been writing down their observations of the Adirondacks since, well, Samuel de Champlain here, a long time ago, when he and some indigenous folks were paddling down Lake Champlain in the 1600s, I think it's 1608, and he just wrote down everything he saw, what was normal back then. And one of his quotes was, I noticed while observing the country some very high mountains on the eastern side, on top of which there was snow. So of course, if you're looking on the eastern side as you're paddling down Lake Champlain, that would be the Green Mountains. So, what's so unusual about that? Well, this was in July in 1609. So Champlain had no idea how interesting that was going to sound centuries later. I didn't have the idea that the world was going to change that much. Well, we are now, it's our watch for us to write down what's normal, and helps you measure the changes in the world if you have something to compare it to. So one of the things we're doing at the college is we've established something we're calling the Phenology Trail. This goes with a class called The Science of Climate Change that I've been teaching in the spring. And the students are building up a long-term observational database of things that happen in the spring related to climate. So it can be the birds, the bees, the flowers when they open up, when the ice goes out, things like that. Building on observations I just did as a nature diary starting in around 1990. So we've got like decades of data now. We write down when the robins show up, when the maples, the red maples bloom, things like that. And then the students analyze for trends and compare them to the temperature records. And interestingly, we do see some changes. The robins are coming earlier. The spotted salamanders who migrate across Keys Mills Road on the first warm, rainy night of spring, they're coming out earlier on average, but the red maples are not. So that's interesting. It's a mixed bag. Some things are changing, some are not. There can be interesting effects of that if things get out of whack, like if an animal doesn't have its food supply ready for it. But one of the big questions is, why isn't everything changing equally? And you can see that in the weather records. If you look at the spring months when we do our study, it's got the least change of all. So you got like February, March, April, there's basically almost no warming pattern at all. And then there's a very slight one after that. So that's probably why we're getting inconsistent results, at least for now. If that changes, the students will pick it up in their long-term study. So the last part, we'll wrap up with autumn here. That's the second greatest warming, at least for September, October, not so much in November. And unfortunately, most people who do these kinds of measurements, you know, the phenology things, tend to focus on spring, maybe because we're eager to see winter go and you're happy the robins have shown up. Not so many people look in the autumn, but that should have actually bigger changes because the temperature changes have been bigger too. Turns out, coincidentally, if any of you took introductory biology, since I was teaching at least at Paul Smith's College, we send the freshmen out to collect plankton from the lake every fall, partly just so they can see real wild microbial animals and algae and things like that in the lake, but also as a long-term monitoring study to watch the water quality change. And they also take the temperatures. And if you take a look over on the left, I've got the summary averages of the temperatures. Starting in 1990 to 1997, the average temperature the students were getting on the point there was about 13 degrees. Nowadays, it's closer to 18 degrees Celsius, that is. So you can see the effects of the warming of the climate showing up in the Biology 101 class data, showing that the lake is actually responding temperature-wise, just like you would expect in a warming climate. So to close, you know, you say, well, you know, what, if anything, can we do about this? The first thing is at least tell what's going on. And people who live here, I think, are best qualified to tell, you know, what are the real effects and what, if anything, needs to be done about them. In the big picture, of course, never thought I'd have to say this, but taking science seriously seems like a radical position nowadays. Science has been under assault recently, and it's a shame. But we stick to the facts here at the college in the science classes. So it's really inspiring to have this kind of an environment for young people to be exposed to. It also means if you learn what is true so you can do what is right, it makes it easier to find win-win strategies. Like, okay, if we switch from fossil fuels, that means, you know, okay, less pollution and things like that, but it's also a new way to make money. So if we can do that kind of a thing as a society, I think there's potential for really good solutions and a less dire future due to all these kinds of changes. So I'll wrap up with this shot. In the spirit of that, unlike what we see in the media or in the culture at large now where we're so polarized, here at the college, we've got a diversity of students from different backgrounds and different opinions. And our goal is to, you know, stick to the facts more, but then also discuss and question and talk. And in a lot of cases, we also do outreach to the community. And this is an example of how people from different backgrounds can actually communicate when you're civil to each other and act like a decent human being. So this is at the St. Regis Falls Fish and Game Club some years ago. In collaboration with Rob Carr from the Wild Center, I taught a class in climate communication. We had a dozen students or 16 students, and we broke up into 4 groups. Each group picked a topic about climate change in the Adirondacks to investigate and then find a target audience to give their results to. This group picked the Fish and Game Club because it had a reputation among the DEC folks. Actually said, we're afraid to go there for fear we'll, you know, have some violent confrontation. They really don't like government telling them what to do. Most of the people don't believe in climate change, all these things, and we saw it as a great challenge. So very carefully, very in a, you know, a well thought out way, the students and I made connections at the Fish and Game Club. It helped that my wife is from the Falls, And we set up a date in the Fish and Game Club hall. The students came and asked the folks, what would you like to know about climate change in the Adirondacks and how it might affect anything, instead of preaching at them. And they said, oh yeah, fish and deer. That's what we'd care the most about. So the students researched it and came up with some of the things I showed you about how, well, milder winters mean more deer. So if there's too big a deer herd because of the Lyme disease, you all here at the Fish and Game Club will have a positive role in controlling the deer herd. They really like that. And then there was the warning about the warming being bad for the trout and things like that. The most amazing thing to me, though, was actually an emotional evening, because we had our students do their PowerPoint talks, the 15-minute thing. The place was packed. And afterwards, the Fish and Game Club folks and the local community stayed for about an hour after the talk, talking to the students like they are in this picture. Just like you would never even imagine could happen with the culture wars we've got going now. So this kind of thing, these kinds of experiences at the college really give me hope for humanity and the future by realizing that even now people can do this sort of thing. And that's how we're going to solve these problems, if at all. So I'm going to check out of the talk here, and let's open up for comments or questions or discussion. I'll stop share, and thank you very much for your time.
Oh, goodness. Let's see. What kind of questions do we have here? Jim out in Washington, I know you had a question, but I lost it. If you could put that in the chat or the Q&A, that would be helpful. And I just got a message that I have unstable connection, so I'm going to turn off my video, but I'm still here.
Nice glasses.
Thank you. Phenology comment. Am I saying that correctly? Phenology. Might some of the species not showing a response to warming be because they are not, because they are more responsive to photoperiod? The Earth is getting warmer, but still pretty much the same sunlight periods.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big fears for ecologists as they watch the phenology happening, like in the spring, like I said, what most people look at. We actually see potential for one of these problems here at the college. Okay, so we got there are these native bees, Colides inequalis, that live on the south-facing slope of Essex Hill. And they come out of their burrows first thing in spring, and then they get their pollen from the pussy willows when the pussy willows are ready, and they're matched to those pretty well. If I remember the numbers right, the bees are coming out earlier, but the pussy willows are not coming out as early. So if you have this kind of thing where the bees come out early and there's not the nectar and pollen for them, that can be a big deal. It's called an ecological mismatch. So yeah, some things you would maybe expect the plants especially to respond to photoperiods. However, another problem is we don't have complete year-to-year data yet for some of those earlier parts of the record. So it's hard sometimes to get a statistically significant trend because there are gaps in the data. So that could also explain some of this. And one of the ways we know that is if you take the data we do have and you plot them out, and then you take the temperatures for those years we have the data for, there's a strong relationship between the temperatures and the behavior of the animals and plants in pretty much every case. So it's possible that, you know, as we go along and get more of these data, and hopefully we'll continue after I'm not around, we'll be able to see these trends more clearly. But the basic thing is, yeah, the spring, except for late spring, is not warming that much. And so you'd expect different responses, a little more random.
Okay. Let's see. Can you speak to changes in Adirondack related to fire and invasive species?
Say that again then. What about the fire and invasives?
Can you speak to changes in the Adirondacks related to fire and invasive species?
not so much for the fires. I would think, you know, with the human presence, the occurrence of fire is so human sensitive anyway, and we're not like the Altona Flat Rock, you know, where it is very flammable and things like that. I think we're still kind of wet and green, and it's hard to get the fires as much. When we had the big fires in the Adirondacks was a century ago, when we had a lot of land clearance for charcoal and things like that. And so I don't really have a great prediction for a forest fire increasing or anything like that. As far as the invasives go, though, you can expect as it gets warmer, critters and plants that did well at lower elevations should start working their way uphill. And as I mentioned, Leanne Sporn and her students have shown that the ticks are doing that exact thing. My big dread, in addition to the ticks, is poison ivy. I love being able to walk in the woods and not have to worry about what I'm brushing up against, and then also not having to pick ticks off me, you know. And
Right.
so I think those two things are what I'm dreading the most.
Sure. To what do you attribute the lack of temperature change in November compared to the adjacent months?
Well, that's the next thing to wonder about, right? So the winter might be the easiest to guess with, because there are big changes happening in the Arctic, and we're, you know, middle latitudes here. So there's something happening to the atmospheric circulation around the North Pole where the jet stream or the polar vortex gets more wobbly,
Okay.
like we've been seeing, you know, with a cold snap here and then a warm over there, right? A loop of cold Arctic air comes down and a bulge of southern air goes up and things like that. So if the changes up there give us more change on average in the winter, that would kind of make sense because that vortex is more active and closer to us at the time. But it's really tough to say. Yeah, we're still, with this local scale stuff, we're still at the stage of trying to document what is happening, and only dabbling so far into why that is. Although if the temperature itself just goes up on average across the board pretty much, that can explain the warming in summer and winter. I want to know why it's not happening in spring so much, or like you said, that 1 month in November, what's going on with that? Those are the transition seasons. So it may have to do with the fight between summer and winter, where it's really playing out, moving around, and then these off seasons are less consistent.
Okay. With the synergy between climate warming of lakes and the ongoing challenge, oh, Al Sample, you had to give me a big word.
Oh, is it chat or Q&A?
It's in the Q&A. Sorry.
Al, let's see. I love, Al had the best quote I ever heard. He said he always liked to hire Paul Smith students because they knew what a maple tree was. I don't see it on the, oh, there it is. Okay, with synergy between climate warming of lakes and the ongoing challenge of eutrophication, do you see changes in fish species?
Never heard that word.
Okay, eutrophication means basically the lakes turning into slime.
Oh, okay. That I understand.
Yeah, more warm water, low dissolved oxygen species. Yeah, so because there are so many other things happening to Adirondack lakes and lakes across North America, frankly, in addition to climate change, it's hard to tease those apart. How much of it's climate and how much is due to sewage getting in or changing the species composition of the food web by adding, you know, one kind of fish versus another and things like that. So it's really hard to tease it apart, although it has been clearly documented that temperature does affect trout. So Cliff Craft and other folks at Cornell have been documenting that, like for example, brook trout don't breed as well when it gets too warm. Other folks are concerned about the lake trout running out of the right temperature and dissolved oxygen. So we can just by common sense infer that some of the losses of those kind of fish are due to the climate, as well as the invasives, the overfishing, the eutrophication, road salt, all these other That actually leads, though, to one interesting project the students have been doing with me over the years, and some of you may be online here too, but we've been trying to find lakes that haven't had all those other impacts done on them. We're calling them heritage lakes that are so remote and protected even from the DEC that they've never been stocked, never been reclaimed, never been dammed, never been acidified either. And there are very few lakes that have had that. So when they do change, or if they do, then it's pretty likely that the climate has a role. And we've actually found a couple of them. One's at Wolf Lake near Newcomb, Huntington Wildlife Forest. So sad to say, they are changing. So there's an indication that it is the climate changing underneath everything.
Okay. I've been on Hurricane Mountain when monarch butterflies turn. Have you seen differences in insect and bird migration habits yet?
No, I think that would be, okay, so we've seen the bird changes, and that's really interesting because some birds are changing and others are not. So the robins are coming earlier in the spring, but the red-winged blackbirds are not. So that's weird. So then it raises the next questions. Okay, where are they coming from? You know, well, maybe the robins are hanging out somewhere where the weather change is being felt, and maybe the blackbirds are coming from somewhere where there isn't so much change, and then they show up any old time or something. Insect migrations, like the monarchs, of course, you'd want to watch that, especially in the fall. And it's harder to do the fall measurements. So if you think about it, well, you know, you're out there in the spring, it's kind of easy to be sure that you saw the first robin show up, but you got to wait around and till you see the last monarch. I mean, how do you do that? It's hard. And how do you know you got it? And all those kinds of things. So no, we don't have those data. It would be fantastic. And I think people need to do it because that's one of the seasons when the biggest changes is happening.
Okay. What can you tell us about Rollins Pond and Fish Creek Pond in regards to warming? Have they also been impacted by browning and warmer waters? I thought I would have had a cooler swim when camping there over the past few summers.
Yeah. Well, just keep in mind what we're talking about here is climate, which is a long-term trend averaged over decades. But there are fluctuations year to year, right? So you could easily have no sense of the warming if you came to Rollins Pond or Fish Creek, you know, once every few years or something, and you happen to hit the cool years or the warm years that do come and go. So you need to see these long-term charts. Most places don't have long-term temperature monitoring happening on them. I would be surprised if Rollins did. And the Watershed Institute at the college does have temperature sensors now, I believe, on Upper Saranac, which Fish Creek runs into. But I don't think they've been out there long enough to get the giant long-term trend. But Dan Kelting or Brendan Wilsey, someone like that, it could actually fill you in on that.
Sure. This is from Jim in Washington. I once belonged to a voluntary weather collection that anyone can set up and do, which is mapping microclimates around the U.S. It's called CocoRahHS, I don't know, .com, FYI. He wanted you to know that.
That's great.
Let's see.
I would say about that, any way you can be connected to these changes is great. You know, if your passion is measuring the weather where you are, I mean, that stuff is great because you're then also likely to be paying attention to the other things, you know, the birds and the bugs and the flowers and things. I think if you're going to do this kind of thing, do it consistently over a long time period. Make a hard copy in paper, so if you get, you know, you fall off a cliff someday, the data are still there and someone can see them. And I think if you're going to do these measurements, I favor doing the animals and plants over the temperature, because there are professionals doing the temperature stuff all the time at these 6 USHCN stations. It's all online, it's carefully vetted, and someone might always want to question your methods on, is your temperature calibrated right, or, did something change near the site? But if you're observing the animals and plants, there is no machine that does that. People do that. And it's going to be people like you or us that will be doing that kind of thing.
So I had a bobcat in the stream next to my house 2 days ago.
In the stream?
Well, it's frozen over. The slough next to my house. It was there. Someone recorded it. He was driving by and saw it, and yeah.
Wow.
Anyway. Yeah, so there's my animal.
Diary like that, okay? Now, What if, like, I've got a nature diary I've been keeping forever, right? I write down when something weird happens, like, okay, it's neat to see the bobcat, right? What if bobcats suddenly get a virus and they go extinct, That'll help you show there's a problem, right? DEC watches them, but I write down things like, my gosh, I had a possum come to my bird feeder all winter one year. It's like, possums, right? They're from down south. Well, now there's a record of that. Or you look at other people's diaries, like Carrie, my wife from St. Regis Falls. She has her uncle's diary from, half a century ago, longer. He wrote down that they used to listen to whippoorwills in St. Regis Falls at night. We don't have them anymore. So those are the kinds of things that show you what is changing.
Sure. Peggy Lynn writes that Racket Lake is harvesting ice on Saturday. NCPR announced the public is welcome. They've been doing it for many years. Have you seen their data?
No, if you want to send them along, I'd love to see. Okay. I always wished ice harvesters would keep records of the thickness too, like the people who did the Ice Palace. Like every year I forget to ask someone to write down, how thick are those bricks? Because that probably is getting thinner over time too.
You're right, I would think. We have a thank you for a really clear presentation of local data. Have you or your students, colleagues, done any work on potential interactions with other neighboring regions? Species shifting up from the south as warming continues and or increases in non-native species.
Yeah, actually, we've also, my students and I in the paleo ecology class have been, and actually with the science of climate change too, we've been informally collaborating with scientists down at Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, the one that Henry David Thoreau made famous. And there have been long-term phenology studies there. We also look at the sediment cores and the long-term changes in the lake. But the phenology there is really fun because the fella doing that over about the same time period I've been running this one, he then compares it to Henry David Thoreau's nature diaries from the 1800s. So you can see the really big changes since Thoreau's time. But they're seeing basically the same thing as we are. Certain animals and plants are changing more than others. So yeah, we're connecting to other parts of New England.
So we have a couple of folks mentioning Texas and their recent big freeze. What do you think? Climate change, fluke, what is it?
Yeah, so the Texas thing is weather, not climate. But the context of that is really since the 70s, the human influence on the average condition of the planet is strong enough that you can now say climate change driven by people plays a role in almost every weather event nowadays too. So to say what that is or how important it was, that's another matter. But yeah, so this is a weather event. You'll have a cold snap in Texas. I haven't had time to look over the whole planet yet because I want to do that with my students too. We're talking about this stuff, but I'm deducing, and maybe someone online knows this too. I'll bet you anything there's some place like Alaska or part of Siberia that's super warm instead, because it tends to balance out. It tends to do, when a blob of cold comes down, a blob of warm goes up somewhere else. So if anybody knows that, maybe you want to unmute or put in the chat. So these are weather events. They're short-term, localized. there is certainly a global climate signal in there somewhere. The big picture is people expect, as the climate continues to warm, certain parts of the climate system will become less stable. And so you'll see more of these weird, extremes, including cold snaps once in a while, like this. Although the average temperature for the whole planet is still going up.
This is a great one.
Uh-oh.
This person teaches middle school. Where can I find your data to share with my class so I can have data-based discussions?
Yeah, that's great. There used to be a really good user-friendly website with charts, easy to follow, for every weather station in the country, and they closed it recent years. So now you have to be a real data nerd, and I'm only a wimpy data nerd to get the stuff. So tell you what, just email me and I'll send you some stuff. If it's from the Adirondacks you want, I can send you some spreadsheets. Excellent.
Do you think that behavioral changes stimulated by COVID-19, like working more from home or driving less, to see talks like this will have an impact on our carbon footprint? Should conservation groups encourage these new habits?
Well, that's a tough one, because our society is an ecosystem, right? And there's lots of moving parts. So yeah, maybe we're traveling less, but because of COVID, some people are traveling more. They're coming up here. I mean, like, look at the trailheads jammed with cars from the city. So,
right.
There's that going on. The internet is not carbon neutral. I mean, it's massive energy goes into letting us have this Zoom session right now. So we're getting more of that. So it's hard to really tell. Another thing is, if people are not outdoors in person, it's harder to fall in love with the outdoors in person. It's just another TV show otherwise.
Sure.
So you could say, maybe it'll pan out that some kids get more turned on because they're online and they learn more. You could also say some get turned off and get more into other things. So we really don't know. We haven't had this situation before. So I'm just kind of one day at a time.
Peter in Maine writes, we are
I think Heather's totally froze up that last one, Curt. She was so excited.
Oh my goodness, I've struck her down.
Great. Am I still here? I'm out.
This, we have all the contact information. Curt, do you want to share your contact information? If anybody wants to write a question to you on your email?
Yeah, sure. You can just Google me, Curt Stager at Paul Smith College. The email is cstager@paulsmiths.edu. Want to try that?
Perfect. Heather, are you back? Are you back now? You were frozen for a bit.
I might be here. Can you hear me?
Muted.
She's looking at you though, Steve, so maybe we better stop talking about her.
There you go. Now she's back.
I can hear you.
Heather, I was just letting Curt know that we had a lot of questions that came in that we didn't get a chance to answer tonight.
Sure.
A lot of wonderful questions, and it was recorded. If anybody wants to tell a friend about tonight, you can find it on YouTube.